Perfect. Thanks. Well, thanks so much for organizing this day. And apologies for not being there in person. I would have loved to be there, both for the cake, but also beyond that. And thanks, of course, for the very generous funding. So what I'm presenting today on is very much work in progress. So really, any thoughts, feedback, comments would be very welcome. The one sentence description of the project is that I'm asking, what are the macro distributional implications if production requires the input and collaboration of multiple workers with differentiated skills? And I believe that's an important feature of a modern economy producing complex goods and services. Now, a little bit more narrowly, the empirical motivation for the paper are two observations about structural shifts in the landscape of production. On the one hand, the nature and organization of work has undergone very substantial change over the past couple of decades. And one facet of that is that employees are increasingly performing complex or non-routine tasks. Why? One major reason for that is that automation has substituted for humans and the routine tasks. Now, that's obviously a well-established idea, so no contribution here. I just illustrated it here in this first graph using German large-scale survey data. And what that graph indicates is that complex or non-routine tasks make up an increasing share of workers' activities. And this new type of work has two other salient characteristics that will be relevant. For one thing, it tends to be associated with greater training requirements and learning opportunities. And secondly, for its implementation, firms have reallocated or reorganized workers into team-based settings. Now, moving to the more macro level, at the same time, across many different OECD economies, productivity and pay have both become increasingly dispersed across firms or across establishments. So this second graph here picks up on one dimension of that, and it shows that the between establishment component of wage inequality, so that would be the dashed line over the dotted line, that explains the great majority of the overall rise in the dispersion of wages or log wages in Germany since the mid-1990s. Now, each of these phenomena, changes in the nature of work, changes in inequality, have individually received a lot of attention by academics, discussion by policymakers. What I'm kind of trying to contribute in this project is a theory and evidence that connects these micro and macro trends parsimoniously, and in this case, through the lens of a notion of firms as teams, so with an emphasis on the importance of teams. So next, let me show you two more graphs, which in very, very suggestive terms, tell kind of the story of how I think these two phenomena may be connected. I'll then sketch in a very high level the theoretical framework I propose, together with some supportive evidence, and then show you sort of one very tentative but quantitative result. So the solid gray line here plots the return to education if you run a Mincer regression, wages on various worker characteristics, on a year-by-year level, again based on German microdata. So it's been very mildly rising. One can distinguish, though, between, on the one hand, the return conditional on establishment, so adding some establishment fixed effect, and the return on the average schooling in your establishment. And so for the former, the dotted line again indicates that it's been roughly stagnating, so conditional on your co-workers' abilities, your education the return to your own education hasn't increased substantially. But what has increased a lot is the wage return on your co-workers' education. So the first step in the argument will be that this growing importance of your co-workers, or the quality of your co-workers for your own wage, is a very natural outcome if the production environment moves towards team-based production where different members specialize in different tasks, in a way I'll make precise in a second. Now, this graph at the top here only tells us that it's beneficial if you work with high-quality co-workers, right? So a statement about the conditional return. So it leaves open who actually benefits from working with those high-quality co-workers. So the final graph shows here very briefly, using two different measures, that workers have become increasingly segregated across different establishments, meaning that high types work increasingly with other high types, and so benefit a lot in terms of their own wage from working with these other high types. And so the second step in the argument is that this greater co-worker interdependence from step one of the argument encourages firms to hire workers of similar ability. And the reason is that in this environment featuring this specialization where different workers have to work together, poor performance by one team member can substantially pull down the others or the overall output. But of course, as an employer, you don't want to jeopardize the potentially very high output from having a high quality workforce by pairing them with good with bad co-workers, apologies. And this mechanism in equilibrium reinforces co-worker segregation, meaning that different firms have different types of their workers. In particular, I show in the argument that superstar teams, the very best together with the very best, pull away from the rest, translating into greater inequality between firms in worker quality, productivity, and pay. And so this is a two-step argument, which in the project, I formalize in a theoretical model, and essentially that maps the nature of tasks at the micro level, the first graph, to the distribution of wages at the macro level, the second graph. Obviously, I don't have quite enough time to walk through all of it, but I hope that I can kind of convince some of the key elements, or convey some of the key elements. So let's turn to the first part, the micro level, and consider for a moment just a single team. So abstract from any notions of different firms or equilibrium or sorting. And suppose instead there is one manager of an establishment who coordinates the division of labor between n employees. So who should do which task and how much of each task. Each of these workers is characterized by a quality X, which sort of indicates their overall type, their overall quality. What's important is that I assume that workers can also differ in their task-specific productivities, meaning essentially that some worker may be better in some tasks than others, right? Maybe in relative terms, I'm better in writing than in reading. And what we'll be interested in is the comparative statistics with respect to a parameter chi, which controls just how specialized workers are in some tasks, how differentiated they are. And so linking that back to the first graph, the intuition that non-routine tasks are those in which workers are more likely to differ in their productivities compared to routine tasks where kind of almost, the name almost conveys it, almost by definition, every worker is equally productive. Now, in principle, solving that model requires a non-trivial assignment problem, right? Again, like who performs which task and how much of it. The first key theoretical result is that the environment nevertheless emits an aggregative representation. And that's sort of shown here in this first proposition. So it has two terms which in their product define total team output. So the first term here means, can be interpreted as saying that in a high chi environment, an environment with lots of non-routine tasks, teamwork allows for greater gains from specialization, right? The exponent here is greater if chi is high, relative to everyone just having to perform each task themselves. So that's a restatement of a very classic result about the benefits of the division of labor. The main focus of the project is on the second term, though. So that's identifiable as a CES function of workers' types, with a degree of complementarity between co-workers' qualities is shown to be a reduced form object, which depends on this parameter chi. So the second term asserts that production processes in which workers are more specialized, in which chi is greater, feature stronger complementarities between co-workers' abilities. The intuition is that in such environments, it's difficult for some high-quality worker, a high X worker, to compensate for the low performance of a co-worker because the two are very specialized in different tasks. So instead, poor performance spills over. So let me take a brief step outside the model and move a little bit to reduced form evidence. In this case, based on Portuguese microdata. The idea here is that the overall kind of storyline I'm trying to outline is about changes over time in the aggregate economy, but we can provide additional evidence by exploiting cross-sectional variation in some proxy of chi. So specifically what I do here is I regress the wage of a worker on a measure of own worker quality, happy to talk more about how I construct this, on the average quality of coworkers, and crucially on the interaction between the two, the coefficient here being beta 3. Now, these rich Portuguese microdata allow performing that regression for different groups of workers ranked by the complexity of the tasks they're confronted with. So think of this as sort of a proxy for different values of chi. So what this graph then shows is that the magnitude of the interaction term is indeed greater for groups confronted with more complex tasks. So I take this to be support for the first step in the argument. Okay, so let's pause here for a second and then move back to the theory. So suppose we believe then that co-worker complementarities are greater in these environments with more specialization. Why does that matter for macroeconomic outcomes? The question is, who works with whom, and how do changes in chi translate to changes in the evolution of inequality? Now, I want to answer those questions in a quantitative way, and so we need a model in which firms hire multiple different workers. So thus far, we took one team as given in their composition. Now we suppose that there's a continuum of teams, firms, a continuum of workers. If production hires, so if a firm hires some different workers, production kind of happens in the way I just described in the first part. And we ask, if that's the case, what's the equilibrium distribution of workers? Who gets paired with whom if hiring takes place, in particular in a labor market that's characterized by search frictions? These search frictions are important because it essentially means that if a firm bumps or meets or receives an application from a worker, let's say for the sake of argument, there's a low quality candidate, but they already have a relatively good candidate, a relatively high quality workforce, they need to trade off two things. On the one hand is the opportunity cost of having to search further, right? So if we don't hire that worker, we have fewer persons who produce relatively less. So we forego that profit. And we need to trade that off against the opportunity cost of having a relatively low match quality. And the importance of that match quality for hiring decisions depends on that parameter chi. It depends on the strength of these co-worker complementarities. Now, in principle, solving for the stationary equilibrium of this model is a numerical task, but for a very stylized version, I provide a series of closed form results which very tightly characterize how this matching of workers into teams is shaped by chi. And here's sort of one graph that illustrates a little bit the logic. So on the horizontal axis is the type of the worker, that's the x. On the vertical axis is the average type of the co-worker with whom that worker on the horizontal axis is paired with in equilibrium. And we can see different lines being plotted, which represent different combinations of search frictions and the strength of co-worker complementarities. So starting with this horizontal dotted line, this is the case if there's zero co-worker complementarities, which is a little bit of a standard assumption in many models in the literature. In that case, each type gets on average just the population average as co-worker, and I've normalized that to be that the distribution goes from 0 to 1, so that's the average is 1/2. If there are no search frictions, so that's this 45-degree line, then we're in a world of pure assortative matching, the best work with the best. That's kind of theoretically neat, and again, an important benchmark is not what we observe in the data, right? So in the second, one of the earlier graphs, we saw that the sort of degree of co-worker sorting is something 0.4. In this world of pure sorting would be 1. So we're interested in sort of cases in between these two extremes. In particular, illustrated by the gray solid line, if there are weak complementarities, then yes, on average, bad types will have worse co-workers than good types, but sometimes they're lucky, and they're also good paired with a better co-worker, so the average co-worker is better than themselves. The opposite is true for very high types. Now, when co-worker complementarities get stronger, when there's a higher value of chi, then per this orange line here, the quality of the average worker falls for low types, and it increases for high types. Essentially, this means that firm matching decisions are such that when chi is high, when the tasks are very complex, then there's an increase in co-worker sorting. Superstar teams of the best working with the best pull away from the rest, while laggards fall behind. Now, coming almost to the end, the challenge for a quantitative assessment is that we really need a measure of these complementarities and how they change over time. And that's a little bit of a hopeless enterprise, because we generally don't even have measures of individual productivity. So the prospect of estimating co-worker complementarities in production is pretty hopeless. So the third theoretical result of the paper tries to address that problem. The math is in the paper, but the gist is that through the lens of the model, co-worker complementarities in production are very tightly connected to complementarities in wages. And so the first can be inferred from the second. Practically, that means that the sort of regression evidence we just looked at can serve as micro moments to discipline the degree of production complementarities to estimate the value of chi when parameterizing or estimating the model. And so right now, I'm exactly in the process of doing that. I'm afraid I don't have sort of a very solid quantitative takeaway to give you, but essentially, at the moment, I'm structurally estimating the model to match the set of micro and macro moments of the economy in 2010. And then the counterfactual exercise would be to ask, what if everything is constant, except that the degree of co-worker complementarities, as implied by the micro evidence, would be at the level of, say, the mid-1980s. And hopefully in 1 month's time or so, I have a firmer quantitative result. But at the moment, it looks that indeed a counterfactual exercise of this type seems to suggest that a change in the nature of task has the potential to explain a large increase in the between-firm share of wage inequality. So with that, I'll wrap up. And yeah, thanks so much for listening. And yeah, looking forward to any questions.
Thank you very much for that. So Ilong is going to open this.
Okay, this is a very exciting talk. So I actually have two questions. So one question is about model and one question is about the measurement. So in terms of model, like since when you are using the CES production function, you already impose that the workers are complementary with each other, right? But in a search model, when the firm hire workers and they start to see all the new workers, instead of like always let the worker to fill the vacancy, they can also using the new workers to replace the existing workers, right? So there could be a potential channel that workers are substitutable to each other with each other. And my second question is about the measure. So I mean, there will be an equation to get these wage complementarities. But my concern is that it's hard to distinguish these wage complementarities with firm-specific TFP shocks. So when you think about workers get higher wage complementarities, in your current model, you impose that really coming from the worker side channel, if we think about a production function. But then it can also coming from the capital side, for example, right? So if there is kind of the firm receives certain kind of new funds and increase the R&D, then the firm, of course, will hire more workers, and the workers seems to be better paid because they are working in a more productive position. But that is initially is really coming from the TFP that the firm is having is kind of changed. Maybe there will be some way to disentangle these two channels, but that's kind of my question. Okay.
Amazing. Thanks a lot for these. Yeah, that's super helpful. So let me take these in turn. So on the first one, I guess there were sort of two components. So for one thing, in the CS function, or this like micro-founded CS function, I don't actually strictly assume that workers are necessarily substitutes. So in the extreme case of this parameter chi being 0, this reduces to a standard additive function, in which case they're just like perfect substitutes. So here allow for both complementarity and substitutability. Now, this replacement channel is something I'm super curious about. I don't allow it in the very basic version of the model at the moment, but I'm playing around with precisely that mechanism because it's very interesting. It means that firms, on the one hand, might, let's say firms with a good workforce, might, on the one hand, be more willing to accept a poor co-worker in the team because precisely because they can later replace them with a better co-worker. On the other hand, that process of gradual upgrading might lead towards greater co-worker sorting over time. What remains the case, though, is that the decision for whether or not to fire a certain worker and replace them with someone else will be influenced by the strength of these co-worker complementarities. So I think it's a very interesting additional channel, but one that's not sort of inconsistent with the notion that co-worker complementarities have important implications for the shape of or the direction of labor market matching. For the second one, yeah, absolutely. So it's a non-trivial problem. We go back to this slide again. At the moment, what I do is to include firm fixed effects. So that's one way to at least try and control for some unobserved firm heterogeneity, which could influence essentially bias the estimate of beta 3. Would you, I guess, or the way I interpreted your point was also bad, but there could be a time varying component. I have played around with also including firm times or establishment times time fixed effects, which would try to absorb that, or alternatively to control for observables, insofar as in the Portuguese market data actually have measures of firm capital at a yearly level. So I'm trying to absorb that, but it is, yeah, it's definitely a sort of a concerning, confounding factor. So any additional suggestions would be amazing.